It's Game Boy World, and this is the Final Fantasy Legend. In America, game releases tend to hit thickest in October and November so that all the big games are out and available in time for post-Thanksgiving Black Friday sales. In Japan though, the biggest releases usually show up at the end of December, and so we see about half as many Game Boy releases in December 1989 alone as we did throughout the entirety of the year. It also helps that the system launched in April, meaning developers and publishers had the better part of the year to get their act together and start to get a handle on Game Boy by the end of '89. It would be nice to say that as the system matured, the games became better and more refined, but this would be a lie. Still, that's true for every system, and in any case, amidst the growing dreck, the occasional gem appears. And so for Game Boy, we have the Final Fantasy Legend, the system's towering achievement for 1989. Literally towering, in fact, because it's about a tower. Squaresoft's portable debut offered, without question, the deepest and most substantial game experience yet seen on Nintendo's new handheld, or any handheld, really. You might expect that to be the case, given the Final Fantasy in the title, although Legend wasn't really a Final Fantasy game. It was more of a business connection invented by some marketers to tie in with the recent US release of the original Final Fantasy for NES, which debuted a few months before Legend made its way to America in 1990. In Japan, Final Fantasy Legend was called Makaitoshi SaGa, or Warrior of the Spirit World Tower, SaGa, with a randomly intercapped G in the word saga for some reason. According to both its packaging and story in Japan, it had nothing overtly to do with Final Fantasy aside from being a Squaresoft RPG with turn-based mechanics. The American localized title wasn't entirely off base though. SaGa was a project headed up by Akitoshi Kawazu, one of the half-dozen designers on the original Final Fantasy. As the biggest fan of tabletop games and RPGs on the Final Fantasy staff, in fact, Kawazu had even been made lead designer on the game's first sequel. This made a lot of people very angry and has widely been regarded as a huge mistake. Final Fantasy proved to be an ailing Square's desperate saving throw, and it succeeded on the strength of its populist appeal. Kawazu, however, looked at the concept of accessibility, furrowed his brow, and made a Final Fantasy with enough arcane mechanics to make wizardry blush. Despite all the interesting ideas that Final Fantasy II introduced to the series, things like a rotating cast, a strong central narrative, and a number of inventive skills and spells, it also demanded players work within the boundaries of its very unusual play dynamics. Little quirks made for a pretty bewildering game. Most infamously, of course, is the fact that the best way to win was to spend hours beating up your own party members. The idea, Kawazu once told me, was to make character development more about nurture than nature, letting your party define itself through its actions rather than by the class you selected at the outset of the adventure. So in Final Fantasy II, a sword-wielding warrior would become stronger and more proficient with swords as they killed more monsters with swords. A mage would become more effective with the specific spells they tended to sling. Likewise, characters who suffered enemy attacks would gain endurance in the form of hit points and defensive stats. It's not a bad idea, really, but the problem is that in practice Final Fantasy II's mechanics tended to result in over-specialization, and we all know where that leads. Characters quickly lost any versatility as they began to fall into certain combat patterns, meaning you wouldn't want your sword expert to switch to that powerful new axe you just found because the disparity between that warrior's expertise in swords and axes rendered the superior weapon's statistical advantages moot. Meanwhile, characters in the rearguard tended to be the targets of fewer attacks, meaning they would be slower to grow in stamina and defense, hence attacking them to make them stronger. After Final Fantasy II, Kawazu ventured out to establish his own RPG franchise. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy III reverted to the first game's class-based format, inventing the franchise's iconic job system in the process. A matter of necessity, as it turns out. According to Kawazu, quote, Final Fantasy II was basically my system, and it's an eclectic kind of system. Eclectic because I made it, you know? There was nobody else I could hand off the torch to afterwards because there was nobody else who could fathom it. And the game we have here was Kawazu's new project, the Final Fantasy Legend, the first entry in the long-running SaGa series. A new property, yes, but at the same time one connected to Final Fantasy II on the strength of certain shared mechanics. Legend retained Final Fantasy II's nurture-based system for one, while at the same time offering the player a massive amount of freedom in character development, like a shrunken-down Ultima or wizardry. Legend lacked predefined party members, giving you a choice of 3 different races from which to build a 4-member party. Not necessarily a 4-man party, mind you. You could select the gender of 2 of the races, humans and mutants. And not necessarily a 4-person party because the 3rd race, monsters, allowed you to bring into your party the exact same creatures you had to battle in combat. Final Fantasy Legend allowed you to build your party from scratch at the outset with any combination of the available character types. In a sense, races served as the class system of sorts, as each species had its own specialty. But more than that, the race system in Legends allowed you to determine how you're going to tackle the game, and to customize the randomization inherent in your adventure. Those who loved Final Fantasy II, for example, would want to build a team of mutants, who develop according to the unpredictable vagaries of nurture-based mechanics. It's worth mentioning that mutants were called espers in the Japanese version, which gives a better sense of what they're actually about: magic and other mentalist skills. Mutants could be trained up to become effective melee combatants, but their real strength was in their mana power and their collection of spells. The potential power of mutants, however, was offset by their mercurial nature. Not only did their stats evolve according to their combat role, they even had a spell called ESP, which existed strictly to increase the likelihood that their mana stat would increase at the end of battle. But the actual set of skills a mutant could draw on at any given time was determined by the game's fickle random number generator. At the end of each battle, a mutant's stats could improve according to their combat actions, and at the same time, their selections of spells had a strong chance, roughly 1 in 3, of changing. A weak spell might have been replaced by a powerful one, but the opposite was every bit as likely to happen. A spell could even disappear entirely, or be replaced by a skill which had a maximum of 0 castings, making it completely useless. A mutant could suddenly develop a resistance or weakness to elements as well. A mutant party member therefore became something of a crapshoot. They could go from useless to the most powerful warrior in the team and back again in the space of just a couple of battles. You never knew exactly how a mutant was going to evolve, and learning to roll with their chimerical tendencies, or else saving compulsively to reload anytime you lost a precious superpower, became part of the game. If this were the extent of the game's mechanics, Final Fantasy Legend would be every bit as reviled as Final Fantasy II. But Kawazu had learned his lesson, and Legend didn't double down on the inscrutable. Instead, it offered alternatives. So for the player who balked at the idea of an ever-changing party of mutants, there was always the human race. Humans, unlike mutants, lacked any randomness at all. Humans couldn't even level up. Their power derived entirely from equipment and items. A human's strength came from the strength of its gear and weapons, and in order to effect permanent stat changes, you needed to feed them expensive consumable items. The price of leveling up and the degradation of equipment, yes, that powerful sword has only a set number of uses, I'm afraid, made humans expensive allies but staunchly reliable ones. Unless, of course, their sword shattered in battle. And then somewhere between mutants and humans, Final Fantasy Legend offered monsters. Unlike the other races, monsters couldn't equip anything at all, and their skills were fixed and consistent. Despite the apparent what you see is what you get setup though, monsters could be incredibly difficult to get a handle on thanks to their ability to permanently transform. At the end of random battles and certain boss encounters, you might have been given the option to eat a hunk of meat. Yes, you could devour your vanquished enemies. If you fed meat to a human or mutant, nothing would happen, but I'd feed it to a monster, and the party member would change. The actual mechanics of monster transformation are never explained in-game, because, after all, Final Fantasy Legend is an Akitoshi Kawazu creation. In his world, explanations are for the weak. However, dedicated players have figured out the rules of meat consumption, which involves complex charts and evolution chains. Monsters belong to subraces, and eating the meat of a given subrace would cause your party member to change into a different creature depending on its own current subrace, and that forms tier on the evolutionary chain. It's weird and opaque, but a determined player, or one armed with a strategy guide, could maximize the potential of their monster. And while it's essentially impossible for monsters to complete the game alone, they can be a helpful member in a well-rounded party. Final Fantasy Legend also introduced one other feature that would go on to become a trademark of the SaGa series: life points. Each time a character fell in battle, they lost one of their limited life points, represented in this game with a heart icon. When a character lost all their life points, that was it. They were gone forever. Invested 20 hours into building up your human warrior? Managed to evolve your monster to the top tier of creature forms? Tough luck. Permadeath is permadeath. True, you can replenish life points, but it's very, very expensive, especially in the early going. So with those fundamentals in mind, the Final Fantasy Legend begins, placing your party in a town at the base of a mysterious locked tower. You're basically left to your own devices here, though the first world is small enough that you can pretty easily sort out what you need to do. This world, the world of Continent, is ruled by 3 different kings: sword, shield, and armor. By jumping through various hoops, be it hooking up one king with the hot little eyeball monster he's in love with, or avenging another's death by slaying his assassin, you'll eventually acquire the legendary sword, shield, and armor that gave the kings their monikers. Equip those on the curiously bare statue of the legendary hero that stands in a town near the base of the tower, and you're given a sphere. Use the sphere at the door to the tower and voila, the adventure begins. What's striking about the Final Fantasy Legend is its decidedly blunt atmosphere. Maybe it's a function of the limited space the tiny Game Boy cartridge offered for dialogue, but Legend's characters are hilariously terse. That means you never have to wonder too much about how to advance the game. The clues for solving puzzles, like the one that unlocks the legendary hero's sphere, are always fairly direct and to the point. But it also means your heroes aren't particularly noble or heroic. They're more like sassy mercenaries. So when King Armor asks you to hook him up with a sexy eyeball monster, you agree, but you say only if the king will give you a reward. When you conquer enemies, there's no mercy or forgiveness involved. You proclaim your foe's awfulness and land a killing blow in a cutscene. Basically, your party members only ever speak up to be jerks. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the entire premise of the Final Fantasy legend is as unusual as its character mechanics. The world in which you live exists as multiple levels inside the tower that rises to the sky, though somehow each world also contains the tower itself. As you advance to each new level of the tower, you unlock a small self-contained world. Inside each world, you unlock different quests to advance your way forward, and finally, inside each new world, you complete different quests to unlock more levels of the tower, gradually working your way to the top. And at the top, you meet God himself, and then you kill God because you're a sassy mercenary, and it turns out God is also kind of a jerk. Much like the balance of in-game races though, the strangeness of Final Fantasy Legend's character mechanics and world design is offset by a fairly nuts and bolts battle system. All the weirdness of the game serves as embellishment for what amounts to a straightforward combat setup. It's all turn-based, done up in the 8-bit Dragon Quest style. A random encounter kicks off, pitting you against a monster or two seen from a first-person perspective, and you act in rounds per side. A single monster sprite in the combat view can actually represent a group of multiple enemies, meaning you have to attack the front monster of a group unless you use multi-target abilities, something mutants excel at and a great reason to keep one in your party despite their unpredictability. It's all very Dragon Quest-like, and should seem familiar to anyone who's played that RPG series, which, of course, in 1989, was pretty much anyone who bought a Game Boy. It's a dowdy, reliable battle setup, and its rock-solid classic design makes a durable foundation for all of Final Fantasy Legend's more arcane mechanics. The complexity of transforming monsters, the chaotic madness of mutant evolution, the steady entropy of human weapons, the surreal world design. All of these are made far more palatable by the fact that they hang on a pleasantly old-fashioned battle system. Of course, it also wouldn't be a Kawazu game without some sort of gaping exploit. In this game, a bug affecting certain weapons and their probability to strike for critical damage means that you can instantly kill the final boss in a single hit. God, as it turns out, is surprisingly weak to chainsaws. Given its vintage and the limitations of its technology, the Final Fantasy Legend isn't quite a timeless classic. And that's to say nothing of how opaque certain of its game mechanics tend to be. And yet, the exact qualities that make Legend so mystifying also make it fascinating. Its unique traits, including the unprecedented ability to save anywhere outside of combat instantly with a battery backup, allow it to hold up quite a bit better than most 8-bit console RPGs. It's not necessarily the friendliest game, and yet it's forgiving enough to be wonderfully approachable. And equally commendable is the fact that Square didn't really water the game down despite its portability in the Game Boy's younger audience. The Final Fantasy Legend is a compact yet fully featured RPG. For many gamers, it represented their first real exposure to the genre, and as such tends to be fairly well regarded by gamers of a certain age. Sadly, America never saw the enhanced WonderSwan remake of the game, and Square Enix has yet to republish the SaGa games on 3DS Virtual Console. Thanks to Sunsoft's late 90s reissues of the Game Boy Final Fantasy titles though, Legend isn't too hard or expensive to come by these days. And really, it remains a game worth tracking down, not only as an entertaining RPG, but also as one of the most intriguingly idiosyncratic works for the Game Boy. With rumors of a new SaGa title being in the works, Final Fantasy Legend remains relevant 25 years later. Plus, in an era where it's so hard to find games that represent one designer's singular vision, the Final Fantasy Legend lets you see what happens when a man with a very unconventional and distinctive vision of RPGs is given free rein. Akitoshi Kawazu, we salute you, you crazy, crazy man. For more games about killing God with a chainsaw, keep reading GameBoyWorld.com.